This week on Talking Politics USA, Trump's Putin outburst.
President Trump called me to tell me he is, quote, off.
It feels like the gloves are coming off a little bit.
He thinks he's got this special relationship with Putin. How can he be this aggressive?
Is a third term on the cards?
He says, a lot of people are asking me to run for a third term. Now, we don't know exactly who these people are.
Who has done this before? Vladimir Putin.
A torrent of tariffs approaches. Are Americans buying it?
Nobody's holding up signs saying it's Liberation Day coming. It's Liberation Day. That's not something that people are cheering for.
Hello and welcome. I'm Lucy Watson, filling in for Tom this week, and Dan joins me from Washington as always. Hello, Dan.
Good morning.
And the former White House staffer Laura Schwartz joins us again from Chicago. Hello, Laura.
Very happy good morning to you all. Wonderful to be back.
Now, even in the fiery days of Donald Trump's second term, it's not often we have to get our bleeping machine out for the US president. But in an unrecorded phone call with NBC News, he couldn't contain his frustration over the lack of progress on a Russia-Ukraine ceasefire deal. And he hit out at Putin for saying once again that Zelenskyy should not be in charge of Ukraine.
President Trump called me to tell me he is, quote, off with Russia's President Putin and threatened to impose secondary tariffs on Russia's oil.
Now, a few hours later, he also turned on Volodymr Zelenskyy, accusing him of backing out on the long-awaited US-Ukraine minerals deal, which they've still not signed.
I think Zelenskyy, by the way, I see he's trying to back out of the rare earth deal. And if he does that, he's got some problems, big problems. We made a deal on rare earth. And now he's saying, well, I want to renegotiate the deal. He wants to be a member of NATO. Well, he was never going to be a member of NATO. He understands that. So if he's looking to renegotiate the deal, he's got big problems.
I mean, Dan, every single day of your reporting life, you must wake up and think, what's being done, what's being said today? It must be totally exhausting. I mean, I've been out there myself working on the East Coast back in 2012 when it was Obama at the helm. Such extraordinarily different times then. But Dan, starting with this chat, whether it was planned or not to NBC, the words he uses about Putin, how irritated and frustrated he was, this is extraordinary language. Why do you think that he's suddenly gone completely the other way, a total change in direction to how he's been speaking about Putin in recent weeks? Is it part of his strategy or just simply an outburst, do you think?
It feels like an outburst, doesn't it? The use of this sort of very intemperate language. I mean, he is notoriously sort of mercurial anyway, but I think this is frustration at not being able to get this deal done as quickly as he promised and as he thought he'd be able to do. And I think that is now coming out in some of these kind of calls and interviews, and you saw on Air Force One there venting his frustration against President Zelenskyy. This was never going to be an easy deal to do, partly because at the heart of the problem are those territories, those oblasts, provinces of Ukraine that Russia is partly occupying. And Russia has consistently said it wants to take all of those four areas. And that is something that President Zelenskyy and many Ukrainians are implacably opposed to. So there is a really difficult territorial question at the heart of all this. But even just trying to get them to sign a 30-day peace deal, which seemed like it was possibly on the table, that's sort of gone nowhere. Even trying to get this maritime peace deal and, not hitting each other's energy infrastructure, well, they've kind of agreed to that, although, both sides are accusing each other of breaking it. So even the kind of baby steps towards a wider deal don't really seem to be happening at the moment, and that's clearly coming out. What's interesting is this is the first time I can remember Donald Trump criticizing in any way, really, Vladimir Putin. Up until this point, really, he has been in lockstep with Vladimir Putin on many different issues. now suddenly, it feels like the gloves are coming off a little bit, and he's clearly getting frustrated with how long this is all taking.
Dan, you make such a good point, and diplomacy is often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think it's diplomacy mixed with this great urgency by the Trump administration that has been frustrated because whether it's Zelenskyy or Putin or Trump's own administration getting in the way, we haven't seen movement forward. This was a campaign promise. He walked that back a few weeks ago, saying, he was sarcastic when he said he would end the war on day 1. And now he set this Easter deadline, which is coming in just under a month, about 19 days from now. So I think that the administration is getting very frustrated. He's said disparaging things about Putin maybe a couple of times before. I think this is about the 4th time. But I think the difference here is that he really talked about the secondary tariffs against countries working and buying things from Russia, such as Turkey, Iran, and so forth. So I think it's really interesting to see that he's maybe putting some action behind his threats. I think that's what I'm seeing a little bit more nuanced this week. But every week, it's definitely something different.
And Laura, is this very much these actual threats to Putin? Is this another way to force his hand to speed up this process?
I think this is the way that Trump is talking to Putin. We expect another phone call this week from President Trump to President Putin forthcoming. We don't know exactly what day or the details, but I think that it was a very well-planned remark that Trump made in this telephone interview with NBC News this weekend. And we'll see if there's any reaction from Putin. So far, Putin hasn't really had too much of a reaction. He thinks that he can drive this at the table because he thinks that he can control Trump. So you've got 2 men thinking the same about the other, and nothing really moving forward enough for actual progress.
Laura, I mean, what interested me when I heard this last night was, a couple of weeks ago, Trump was calling Zelenskyy a dictator. He has harangued him and humiliated him for weeks and cast doubt over his credibility himself. Then when Putin does the same, why is it not okay for him to do it? Why is it, do you think that President Trump has suddenly taken objection to it?
I think it's because Trump thinks Putin's his friend. I think it's because he thinks he's got this special relationship with Putin. How can he be this aggressive when Trump wants to have the control? It's like when you watch Trump and other foreign leaders have a handshake at the beginning of a bilateral meeting or one-on-one meeting. You look to see who's going in for the upper hand, who's grabbing that elbow. This, in essence, is a handshake somebody's trying to one-up the other on. And it's going to be interesting to see how long this stands, because just a week ago on this podcast, Dan and I were speaking about the fact that Steve Witkoff, who's the big broker of peace in Ukraine and Russia for the administration, was talking about how, Putin's this great guy. He's a smart guy. He's a nice guy. I admire this guy. And the Trump administration stood behind him. So we're getting a lot of conflicting messages. And like I said, diplomacy is always a long, hard slog. It's meant to be that. But I'm just hoping that they stay at the table for it to see some resolution, some ceasefire in the near future. But so far, not seen it.
But long, hard slog is perhaps not the Donald Trump way. He prefers a quick, fast deal, Dan, would you say?
I mean, I think Donald Trump is a man in a hurry at the moment, and he really wants to get this deal done by Easter, which is looking vanishingly unlikely. And I suspect what he's beginning to realize is if Vladimir Putin criticizes Volodymyr Zelenskyy's legitimacy, i.e. says he shouldn't be the one who, to sign any deal, well, that calls into question, well, who should represent Ukraine? I think Vladimir Putin has suggested some sort of UN imposed interim government or something, but all of that would take time. If you're going to hold elections, that would take time. And that's the one thing Donald Trump feels he hasn't got. He's sort of painted himself into a bit of a corner by making these promises, setting a deadline, and now realizing it's going to be very difficult to meet it.
In that same NBC News interview, Trump has also given his strongest indication yet that he's serious about running for a 3rd term. He said he's not joking about wanting another 4 years from 2029 and said there are methods to make it happen. I mean, I don't really know quite where to begin on this. Laura, I mean, how concerned are you about that this could turn into, or this is shaping up to be, a constitutional crisis?
Well, it very well may be. And that's because with Trump, you've got to take him at his word. You really have to. He's been, kind of floating this about a third term for the last couple of months since he got into office. Some of his supporters, like Steve Bannon, has also been floating this. So it becomes real after a while. It's almost like he focus groups it like a TV show. He lets it out there. He lets it he sees what the reaction is. And then he says, a lot of people are asking me to run for a third term. Now, we don't know exactly who these people are. There hasn't been any in-depth polling on it, but that's what Trump says. Our Constitution in America makes it very clear. It was ratified in 1951 with the 22nd Amendment that said no person can be elected twice to the presidency. Now, there's also a 12th Amendment that speaks about what if you're vice president, which is a little murky. And the law journals, even back in 99, have said, maybe this isn't as clear cut as we think. So one of the methods Trump is sort of floating out there is that, well, if JD or another Republican runs and wins for president with Trump on the ticket as vice president, that president could step aside, and because of succession, well, guess what? Donald Trump could become president again. Now, whether that lawfully would stand, it would see a lot of pushback from scholars and from lawsuits. The Supreme Court would ultimately have to get involved. But if it was to change the Constitution, and there is a bill on the Hill that somebody did introduce, I think last year it was, about allowing presidents to have a third term, really to gain favor with Trump. That hasn't moved anywhere. But it would have to get through the Congress, and it would have to be ratified by, I think it's 2/3 of the states, Dan, and that really doesn't seem plausible, especially in such a short time. So while legally it's a bit murky, the Constitution, is pretty clear. It'll be an interesting conversation. I mean, he's putting it into the ether for a reason.
I mean, Dan, you'd want to throw in the towel and get on the first plane home, wouldn't you, if that was happening? Could you cope with yet another
I'm not sure
4 years?
Not sure I'll last
of
another 4 years. Yeah, I mean, well, there's a couple of things to say about this. I mean, first of all, think who has done this before that we're just talking about. Vladimir Putin. When he came up against his term limit, it was Dmitry Medvedev who took over the presidency, and Putin became prime minister for a bit. But we all knew who was effectively running Russia at the time. So there is kind of form with this. I mean, the other thing is, either he could run as vice president to JD Vance's president, and then Vance would step down, or maybe he just stays as vice president and is still has a huge influence over the party. But he has increasingly talked about this throughout the campaign. They were sort of done in a jokey way. He'd sort of say another term, maybe more. Now this seems to be coalescing around a genuine idea of somehow this not being the end of his political career. Quite remarkable. I mean, obviously, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had 4 terms back in the 30s and 40s, and then the Constitution, the precedents were changed after that, so that you would only normally be able to serve 2 terms. But the 22nd Amendment, I think I'm right, Laura, it says you can only be elected twice. It doesn't say that you can't step in if you're vice president, if your president steps down, right?
Right. But that's where the 12th Amendment to the Constitution comes into play, because it says, and I'll read this, no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of the president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States. So there's really 2 amendments at play here. And I think we're going to hear a lot of fodder about them. And obviously the Trump supporters will see them in one light. The constitutionalists and Democrats will see it in another light. It's going to be a very interesting conversation, because you're right. Putin did the same thing. And there's some great reporting out about, just like ebbing government and the way it's done over a period of 10 years or so when it comes to authoritarianism, et cetera, in Eastern Europe. So when you look at this is all unfolding in a couple of months. So it's everything's at rapid speed with Donald Trump, but that may not be on his side on this one.
Well, Laura, it might be at rapid speed, but he would be, what, nearly 83? Would age even be considered a barrier?
Kirsten Welker asked him this because he'll be 82 years old at the end of this term and said, would you even, be able to or want to? And his response was, well, I like to work. So I think Donald Trump really, unless it's Joe Biden's age, he doesn't see his own age. He just gets out there. And I have to tell you, to the American people, he's out there talking every day, whether you think it's nonsense or not. He's speaking to the American people, whether from the Oval Office or Air Force One, et cetera, et cetera. He loves to communicate. Let's put it that way. They see him as pretty virile. Like, he's up, he's going, he's everywhere, he's talking. So I don't think they necessarily see him in that age category that they saw Joe Biden.
Now, countries and businesses around the world are bracing for a slew of new tariffs set to be announced on Wednesday in what Trump himself is styling as America's Liberation Day. Now, as we've discussed previously on Talking Politics UK, British officials have been hard at work behind the scenes to secure some exemptions from the taxes, but they will not be delighted to hear these comments from the US president.
You're expecting to hit something like 10 to 15 countries, is that right?
No.
All of the countries across the board?
Not 10. I don't know who told you 10 or 15 countries. You'd start with all countries, so let's see what happens.
So all countries, so exemptions, UK or otherwise, look perhaps unlikely despite ferocious discussion to try and avoid it. Now, calling it Liberation Day, first of all, this is the third time, I think, that he's used this expression. Once on Election Day back in November, once on his inauguration, and now Tariff Day effectively is being called Liberation Day too. I mean, it shows how important that he sees, tariffs, his big policy. Now, he claims that tariffs ultimately are freeing Americans from foreign goods. Laura, do Americans buy into it ultimately?
I can speak for the majority of America quite clearly that nobody's holding up signs saying it's Liberation Day coming. It's Liberation Day. That's not something that people are cheering for. We found out last Friday, consumer sentiment is at a 3-year low in this country. 59% across the board of different wealth levels and all politics say that the economy is in the wrong direction, and they disapprove of Trump's handling of that economy. The Federal Reserve Bank is very skittish. Goldman Sachs, one of our largest banks, just revised the outlook on a recession to 35%. And the markets are wrecked, not here in the U.S., but around the world. We woke up today on a Monday morning, which has seen that this is a few days away. Tariffs can often be used as a negotiating technique. But Trump really is kind of going by the 1890s approach of a former president, William McKinley, who thought that tariffs could really support the operations of the U.S. government. But that's before, Lucy, we now live in this globally interdependent world, which can be mutually beneficial. And Trump sees this as a way to spur innovation, build more factories in America, build up the American worker. But in essence, the way he's going about it, the automakers are very concerned because even the U.S. automakers use foreign parts. Americans are seeing that cars may go up by thousands of dollars, in which Donald Trump said yesterday, I could care less.
He said he doesn't care. I couldn't care less. Yeah.
It doesn't care. Now they revised it and said he doesn't care less if you have to buy a foreign car and pay more money. But you're going to pay more money for an American car as well. So the American people are not all aboard this liberation train. And quite honestly, we're hearing that at the White House. And Dan, I bet you're hearing this in Washington yourself, that Trump's pushing his team to be even more aggressive. But 3 days is a long time at that White House behind the scenes. And we'll see if this is indeed a negotiating tactic or if the last person in the room with Donald Trump before he decides on these tariffs is someone that will be aggressive and will push him to levy something on all countries.
Now, Dan, Downing Street, even last night, I think it flashed up on my phone, it's trying desperately to avoid these taxes coming in and affecting us here in the UK. But it's going to hurt, isn't it? It's going to hurt us here.
Yeah, I mean, I was at an embassy a couple of weeks ago where they were sort of, hopeful that they would be able to get some sort of carve out, as they put it, an exemption for the UK. They felt this could be a kind of Brexit bonus, if you like. We sit outside of the EU, we can make our own trade policy now, and therefore this would be an example of perhaps us being able to negotiate a better deal than Europe was going to get. But that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, he made it very clear in that clip that this is going to apply to everyone. It's going to come in on Wednesday, and it's going to apply, to cars. We've already had steel and aluminium tariffs of 25%. And to pick up a point Laura was saying, this is going to affect the American consumer hugely because, okay, they can choose not to buy a BMW or a car made, a Mercedes or something in Europe, but a lot of the components that go into US cars are brought in from abroad, and they will also be subject to 25%. I think about 60% of the parts that make US-built cars come in from abroad, many of them from Mexico and Canada. So the cost of cars, whether they're American-made or whether they're imported, is going to go up. And we were talking the other day to a second-hand car dealer who said, the ripple effect is second-hand used cars are going to go up in value as well. Obviously, if the price of the new cars jumps 25%, suddenly sellers are going to be able to command a greater premium for their second-hand cars. So all of the prices are going to start creeping up. And once again, we've mentioned this before, that's going to feed back into inflation and, something that is stubbornly still quite high. The Federal Reserve has, really not got much room for cutting rates at the moment, and this is going to make that even more difficult.
And we don't really know what consumer goods are defined by. So I think a lot of Americans are looking at the auto prices because it's just so easy to see. You pass by a dealership, if it went up this week from last week. So I think that's going to be really that kind of bailing point to look at.
I mean, Dan, I suppose watching, the Chancellor give our spring statement early last week, and then within hours, Trump had announced these tariffs, totally shifting, the wriggle room that Rachel Reeves have for, potential disaster, and making us totally at the mercy here of Donald Trump and his whims and his decisions. Is that just how it's going to be the next 4 years, do you think?
It feels like it, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, this kind of, they call it fiscal headroom, which is a complicated way of saying how much maneuvering room the Chancellor has between, the money they take in and the money that goes out, essentially. And obviously, you need to be taking in a bit more than is going out. And I think that fiscal headroom is being eroded even further by the potential tariffs that are going to be levied, by the knock-on effects on the UK economy. So although this sounds like very kind of esoteric economic talk, people in the UK might think, why on earth do I care about car prices in the US? Because it is going to have a direct impact on the UK economy, potentially on tax rises in the UK. It may mean that the Chancellor has no choice come the autumn but to have another look at spending, either cut spending again or put taxes up.
You'll likely all be familiar by now with the extraordinary story of an American journalist being added to a Signal group chat in which classified war plans were shared. Now, this happened about a week ago. Trump is still having trouble making the story go away, unsurprisingly, you might say. He's insisted that there'll be no sackings and considers the matter closed. But even some Republican senators have now called for an investigation. Now, I suppose, first of all, I should just check who's in our group chat. Everyone recognize each other? Yeah, still just Laura, still just Dan and Lucy.
Yeah, we're good.
I mean, I guess we've all done it. Perhaps put in a long lost auntie and she'd start talking about what's going on here and where you live, and she's on it and she doesn't know what's going on, or you've included a friend with the same name, or, reply all emails, all those kind of things. There is room for mistakes, of course. But this is how we imagine national security, massive decisions about war plans being made. You imagine the most secretive, the most secure, not a signal group chat and someone being added by mistake. I mean, Laura, when this first came out a week ago, I mean, what was your reaction as someone who has lived and breathed what goes on inside the White House under the Clinton administration for 8 years? What was your reaction?
I was dumbfounded, Lucy. And then when they try to blame it on the reporter, it was even worse. They should have just admitted the mistake right away and said, we'll no longer use Signal for highly sensitive and classified information. And they could have moved on, right? If you're honest, the truth can't scare you, something that I learned in Washington. So if you're just honest with the American people, this could have been a couple of days story instead of now going into its second week. Now, I have to say, Lucy, when you're hired at the White House, you have your FBI background check, and one of the first briefings you get as a presidential appointee and a White House staffer, and on the other cabinet agencies as well, is from the National Security Staff and the FBI. And it's all about OPSEC. OPSEC stands for Operational Security, and it's everything about what to discuss on phones, what you can discuss over a pager, what gets put in the burn bag, what needs to be discussed in the Situation Room or a SCIF, which is a site of which is completely secure, that all the agencies have and can temporarily be set up on the road. And so even though, yes, we're not using pagers today, the same concerns apply to third-party commercial apps, especially on private cell phones, of which some of these principles were using. So I was blown away that this even happened, because you were told specifically how to do this. And by the way, if you want a secure line and even a secure conference call, all you do is call WACA. That's the White House Communications Agency run by the military. In fact, it's called Signal is their station. And what they can do is they can get you a secure line. And so there's no reason for any of this to have been discussed on Signal. And if I can, 3 things really stood out to me. First, Signal shouldn't be used for highly sensitive information. And then also, we found out that they actually shared information on the Signal chat that came from Israeli intelligence. And Israel called and they said they were very upset that maybe a human source was even compromised because of this intelligence being shared on Signal. And when you think about it, we have what's called the Five Eyes Alliance, in which UK is part of, where we share information. So what will this do to other countries as far as their sharing of sensitive information with us to both protect our country and the world, as well as when you think about what was revealed in the chat about JD Vance and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's loathing towards Europe. There's a lot within here to unpack. And that's why it goes deeper than just the silliness of using Signal. It really goes to our national security. And that's what I think, the White House should have acknowledged right away. Yeah. But now I think there will be investigations into this. And ultimately they'll say never use Signal again for classification of messages. But it was astounding.
I mean, you touched very, very slightly on it there at the end, Laura. But Dan, what do you think this says about how they view national security?
Yeah, it's pretty shocking, isn't it? Adding a journalist, and not just any journalist. This is Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic magazine, who is an ardent Trump critic. I mean, you couldn't have picked a worse journalist to have added to a highly sensitive group chat about potentially attacking Houthi rebels in Yemen. We talked earlier in the week to Larry Pfeiffer, who used to run the Situation Room. He's a long career intelligence officer at the CIA and the National Security Agency. He was really fascinating, getting his perspective. Here's what he had to tell us.
I've been involved in national security and intelligence for over 40 years. I've never known any instance where discussing a military operation beforehand in that level of detail, and have it be done on a commercial platform at an unclassified level, it's just insanity. From what I read, there was enough detail that if the Houthi target had seen that information ahead of time, he could have taken some evasive action.
He told us that all of the principals, the kind of people that were involved in this group chat, have the ability to use secure comms wherever they are. He's even told us that they've managed to get a secure line into the White House from a boat off Martha's Vineyard. So the technology exists for them not to have to use signal. That their staff carry secure phones and have the ability to make sure they can communicate securely. So it does suggest a real kind of slapdash approach to security, which is really worrying. And that has, as you alluded to, Lucy, got a couple of Republican senators asking or demanding for an investigation. The Oklahoma Senator James Lankford and Roger Wicker, who's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, both calling for an investigation. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point we end up seeing the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called before that committee, along with Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor.
Now, as we're nearing the end of our episode, we almost made it without mentioning Elon Musk, but we should talk about this controversial event he held in Wisconsin. Now, the world's richest man appeared on stage and handed out million-dollar checks to voters ahead of an upcoming Supreme Court election in the state. It's been met with accusations that he's essentially breaking the law by buying votes for conservative candidates. Now, I'm going to have to go to Laura. Sorry, Dan. It's only Laura I need to talk to on this because, Laura, you're from Wisconsin, number one. But first of all, can you explain to me, why does he have a cheese on his head?
You know what? We are the largest producer of cheese in the country. I come from Plymouth, Wisconsin, the largest producer of milk and cream within the dairy states. We're very proud of our cheese.
So there's my aha moment. Now I understand.
Now you know. You know what? Cheese heads for everybody. Lucy, yours is in the mail. Dan, I'm going to drop yours off in D.C. this week. But you know what's interesting is Lucy and Dan, I spoke to some of my cousins that are Trump supporters, others that are Democrats, and they all kind of had the same thought that why does Elon think that he can buy our Supreme Court election? And that's really the Democrats' stance in this. They've got big billboards up all over the state. Will you let Elon buy this election? He's put about $20 million into it. The election overall, there's been $81 million poured into a state Supreme Court race. We'll see if the Elon money and the Elon appearance moved the dial towards the conservative judge, or if this is going to be the first stand during the Trump administration to say, no, we can't be bought, and Elon Musk has no sway over us. It's going to be a very quick turnaround to see what worked and what didn't.
I mean, this isn't the first time he's done kind of cash giveaways. We saw it in the presidential election last autumn, and he's kind of showing no sign of stopping with this method, is he?
No, and the state attorney general in Wisconsin actually tried to get this event canceled. But Elon Musk kind of changed the wording because everybody had to sign a petition for conservative justice or something in order to get into the event. And then once they were in the event, then that made them eligible for two $1 million checks he was going to give away. So it's very murky. The same thing happened, like you mentioned, in Pennsylvania during the presidential election. And he was able to skirt it just enough that it happened, and it made a difference. But that was during the election. Now here we are a couple months into administration. We'll see if it works again.
Dan, do you think there's any limits to what Mr. Musk can do?
Well, I think we're about to find out. I think it's important to also say, why the hell does he care about a Supreme Court election in Wisconsin? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that there are fears from the Republicans that if the Supreme Court is tilted to the Democrats, that they will redraw the sort of electoral map and give the Dems an advantage when it comes to the House of Representatives. So there's a political reason, but there's a commercial reason as well that Elon Musk has long wanted to open Tesla dealerships in Wisconsin, and there is a kind of prohibition at the moment from direct sales from auto manufacturers to the customer. You have to go through a kind of franchise. He wants to change that, and I think that's playing into this as well.
So method in his madness, most definitely, always.
Yes.
Hey? Laura, thank you very much. I feel enlightened now about the cheese that comes from Wisconsin. And Dan, as ever, thank you to you too. That is all we have time for this week. We'll be back on Wednesday for our UK edition. As always, you'll be able to watch that on YouTube and ITVX and listen wherever you get your podcasts. But it's goodbye from me and from Dan and from Laura, the whole Talking Politics USA team.